I want to ground ourselves in what our goals are for today. We're going to be first talking about some clarity on what programs are actually required under VAWA. So, as we go through not only just the policy, but we're going to be looking at what this looks like in practice. Then we'll go through you all's updated emergency transfer plan, right? So, that will look like diving deeper into what should happen when someone needs to move quickly, when someone needs to move not only quickly, but move for safety. And then the third part of our conversation, we're going to focus on simple and practical steps that you can take to strengthen your compliance right away. And so if you all agree with this journey today, just give me a thumbs up in the chat or something similar, and we'll move on. As you all are agreeing to our journey today, I want to get into getting the most out of our time. Thank you. Okay, so the question is, how might we get the most out of our 1 hour together? That's going to go super quick. Before we get into all the things that we have planned, Janice and I wanted to share a few important um, ways in which we are approaching this conversation. And so throughout this conversation, we will be using composite examples. These are based on real survival experiences, real barriers, real challenges. But know this, we are not identifying details. So the details have been changed to protect the privacy of folks. I also want to say, please take care of yourselves as we go through all the things, right? And so we realize that some of this content may feel heavy. And so if you need to step away, turn off your camera, grab water, do what you need to do. Whatever helps you all stay present and supported in the moment. You will learn that Janice and I are a really informal group. And so questions are always, always, always encouraged. So as you share, just be mindful to use the identified examples of whatever it is that you're describing or painting us a picture of as we continue to protect the people that we are serving. Um, and so if you have questions, put them into the chat. We will be as attentive as possible. But if you all are good with this, let's get to it. Before we get into more of the conversation, grounding is important, as you all can tell. Um, Janice loves to set us up with terminology and context behind what it is and how terms are used. I think this is really important as we navigate through some of the content and conversation. Um, Language is really important because it matters in this particular work and how we support folks. And so you'll hear different terms being used depending on the context and what we're talking about. So, for example, most victim service providers will use the term survivor, for example. Um, that is the legal term systems use, often uses as victim. Neither of the survivor or victim term is wrong, but it's just best to lead with what we like to call person-centered language. So instead of assuming a label, we want to follow the lead of the person who is experiencing the harm. And so it's just important for us to be person and people centered. This goes the same about when we're talking about abusive partners, all right, or the abuser. So you might hear abuser or you might hear abusive partner. Again, context is really important here. But we want to be thoughtful and intentional with the language we choose based on context and conversation. And this is a way to, again, center the people that we're serving, respect the people that we're serving. And so this is where we want to frame some context here. Okay, Janice, is there anything else you want to add to the terminology piece? Are we good?
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Nastasia.
Sure. I'm going to pass it to you to begin to talk to us about uh, the VAWA Act.
Perfect. All right. So first, we want to just ground you a little bit about the Violence Against Women Act. It was passed in 1994 and has been reauthorized a couple of times since then. When you get a copy of the slides, there's a hyperlink in there so that you can go straight to the VAWA law if you'd like to go there. In fact, these slides are fairly content heavy, and that is deliberate so that you have something to reference when you're looking at these again, because it is a lot, there's a lot of information in the VAWA Act that applies to all of you, but today we're really wanting to stay focused on the emergency transfer plan. So just a few things that we want to cover before we get into that emergency transfer plan. VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, has the word women in the title, but it does apply to all people. So it is not important what your sex is. It does apply to individuals regardless of their sex, sexual orientation, race, color, national origin, religion, familial status, etc. It is also any federal program that administers rental assistance is required to follow the housing protections that are in VAWA. And this is the laundry list that is listed in the law. And you're probably thinking that is really, really small and I cannot read it. So just to help you out, in the red there, you'll see that if you are receiving funding from the continuum of care, from the Emergency Solutions Grant, from your Montgomery County Housing Solutions or Housing Initiative programs, or if you have a survivor who's living in public housing, the HCV vouchers, the housing choice vouchers, the Section 8 low-income housing tax credits, veteran programs, all of those are required to follow the VAWA protections, and the housing protections cover people who are living in that, including private landlords. So, to that effect, we want to start you off with a little poll. Josh is a new landlord in Metro City. Josh has recently purchased a 4-unit dwelling and wants to support his community, so he's agreed to accept referrals from programs that provide rental assistance. This includes ESG rental assistance projects. Josh receives a referral from Mr. Smith and accepts him as a tenant in the program. Josh does not believe he'll have to worry about VAWA housing protections because he is a private landlord and Mr. Smith is not a woman. Is Josh correct? Let's launch that first poll. All right, so is Josh correct that he does not have to worry about VAWA housing protections? Well, you all are on it. This is good. Couple more. All right, let's close out that poll and share the results. And it looks like 100% of you who answered got it correct. He is not. He is not correct. Why is that? Anyone want to come off mute and share their answer? Okay, I can see we're still a little shy, but do know that I'm going to offer you many opportunities to come off of mute and share with us. Josh is not correct because VAWA protections apply to. Ooh, do we have a response? That's right. Men can be victims of domestic violence as well. VAWA applies to everybody. That's right. That's right. And if, as a private landlord, if Josh agrees to accept the federal funds that are covered under VAWA, then Josh must follow the housing protections. Great. Good job, guys. Let's see where we are. All right. So here's your very, very quick primer of housing protections. If you are a survivor living in a covered housing program, the covered housing program cannot deny you admission or assistance because you have experienced VAWA violence or abuse. The covered housing program can also not evict you or terminate assistance to you if the reason is related to experiencing VAWA violence or abuse. So if you are perpetrating violence, you can be evicted or have your assistance terminated. But if you are the person who's experienced that violence, you can't be evicted for it. So, for example, if your abusive partner is forcing you to engage in some illegal activity under threat of violence, and the landlord wants to evict you, if you say that you are a survivor and you have experienced violence, you've been forced into this, the landlord could evict, the person who forced you into it, but they could not evict you because because it was part of the vow of violence or abuse. As a survivor, you have a right to have your information kept confidential, and there are very specific rules around confidentiality that you must follow. Anyone living in a covered housing program has the right to call emergency medical services or law enforcement as many times as they need to without penalties. And I don't think this applies to Montgomery County, but in some communities, they have nuisance laws where if the police arrive too many times to an apartment, they can evict you, and a survivor is exempt from that. They're protected under the Violence Against Women Act. Um, and a landlord or property owner cannot coerce, intimidate, or threaten someone because they are they're taking advantage of their housing protections under VAWA, or because they're participating in an investigation into a VAWA complaint. There are some resources out there that can help support you. First and foremost is the VAWA Notice of Occupancy Rights form. That's a hyperlink there. They're all hyperlinks. Uh, the VAWA Notice of Occupancy Rights must be given to every tenant every time a person is admitted or provided rental assistance for a unit. So every application, every time someone is told that they're eligible for that rental assistance. Every time you deny admission or rental assistance to somebody who has applied, and every time a notice of eviction or notice of termination of rental assistance occurs. This means that if you are giving an eviction notice every other month to someone for failure to pay rent, it must be accompanied by that notice of occupancy rights. And the form is fairly long, and I apologize for all of the trees that will be killed on behalf of this law, but it's very important that that be given out because, again, remember, you cannot be evicted or have your rental assistance terminated if it's related to the vow of violence. And so the notice of occupancy rights just reminds people of that. And so some of you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't somebody just lie about this? But research has shown time and time again that survivors don't actually claim that they are like people don't claim that they're survivors just to get those protections. It's much more likely that somebody will hide their survivor status and not claim those protections. Another important right is that survivors have the right to self-certify their abuse. Under the Violence Against Women Act, people do not have to produce a police report, a protective order, um, uh, proof of injury, anything like that. They can just fill out one of those self-certification of abuse forms that you see on the screen. And then today we're going to talk about the emergency transfer. Those are the generic templates that are in this slide, but you will see that Montgomery County has developed a VAWA emergency transfer template that you can use, and all of these resources can be found on the page that HUD has put together for VAWA, and the link is there on the screen. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay. So when we talk about making sure that that VAWA notice of occupancy rights goes out every single time, part of the reason for that is because of universal education as a tool. So research has shown that when you give people information, it both signals to them that you are a safe person to talk to, but it also is planting a seed. And so if somebody is in an abusive relationship or is being stalked by someone, having somebody tell them you have rights, you have protections, I am a person who is here for you, can often help somebody to come forward when they feel like it is safe and they have the ability to do so. So you become uh, like a symbol as a place for somebody to come to that's safe. It does not matter if you do not know what to do when somebody comes to disclose to you because there are national hotlines and there are resources available, and you're going to designate a person who's a VAWA liaison within your program to be able to be that safe person for somebody to connect with. And even if you still don't know, the only thing that you really need to say is what is happening to you is not okay. You deserve to be in a healthy relationship, and would you like me to help connect you somewhere? And Google has amazing resources. You could say National Domestic Violence Hotline, it will give you the number. National Sexual Assault Hotline, give you the number. And all of those resources are in your VAWA emergency transfer plan. So you don't even have to look them up if you don't want to. So, as I mentioned, survivors do have the right to self-certify their abuse, and grantees and landlords are prohibited from requiring third-party documentation. The only exception is if Nastasia and I are living in an apartment together, and Nastasia comes forward to the landlord and says, Janice is abusing me, and I say, actually, Nastasia is abusing me, then in that instance, and only in that instance, the landlord can ask for documentation, certify, like third-party documentation, to be able to determine who is actually the survivor who needs the VAWA protections. And we'll talk in a little bit. I'll give you a little more detail about that. I don't want to go too much into that right now. In addition to the VAWA Emergency Transfer Plan, Montgomery County has created a VAWA lease addendum template. So when a lease is signed by a tenant, they're receiving funding under one of these covered housing programs, they must have a VAWA lease addendum that outlines all of the things that I just talked about and that are in the VAWA notice of occupancy rights. So you'll have the rights and prohibitions, the right to terminate the lease without penalty if you meet the condition for a VAWA emergency transfer, the limits of VAWA, and I'll give you an example in a minute that you will help you remember the limits of VAWA, and the right to confidential treatment of your data. And so as you can see, uh, uh, Seth has already created that document for you. You can just customize it to your example. Before we talk about lease bifurcation, here's my example for you. Nastasia and I are living in that apartment together, and I tell Nastasia, hey, we're going to raise poisonous snakes. And Nastasia's terrified of snakes, but I threatened to kill her if she doesn't go ahead and do this. And so the landlord finds out that Nastasia, who's the leaseholder, is raising poisonous snakes and wants to evict Nastasia. So Nastasia says, hey, I'm a survivor. I'm protected. So she cannot be evicted, right? That's in the VAWA lease addendum. It says you cannot be evicted because you are a survivor. Now, if a landlord uses the lease bifurcation, which is on the screen right now, and says you are conducting an illegal activity because these snakes are from outside the country, so that's criminal activity. And so the landlord is going to bifurcate or split the lease and kick me out. So Janice is gone because Janice was doing something illegal. Nastasia is protected. And now Nastasia lives in the unit, and Nastasia says, you know what? Those snakes were really lucrative. I'm going to keep raising those snakes on my own. Now, Nastasia can be evicted because now she is not being coerced and has nothing to do with the VAWA violence. And so the VAWA lease addendum does allow for landlords to evict somebody when the activity is not related to being a survivor. It only allows you to be protected if the behavior is related to being a survivor. The other piece that you need to be aware of is that in the 2022 reauthorization of VAWA, the HUD updated the definition of Category 4. And so you may know Category 4 as fleeing or attempting to flee. And in the 2022 update, you'll see in the bold that it is now experiencing trauma or a lack of safety related to or fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking. I'm not going to read the rest of it. But the important part of that is the related to piece, which means that Nastasia could have left the relationship 6 months ago and fled to her sister's house. She would still be considered homeless under Category 4 because her homelessness is related to the violence that she experienced. And that's the key, that the violence be related to, not that you have to be imminently. So there's no recency criteria, and you don't have to be literally homeless under Category 4. All right, let's practice what we have been talking about. Zev is a landlord. One of his tenants, Janice, has complained repeatedly about maintenance issues and outdated appliances. Janice wants to move, but she has 6 months left. Zev explained she'd have to pay a fee for terminating the lease early. Little time passes, and Janice states the reason that she needs to move is because she was sexually assaulted on the property. Zev is suspicious that Janice is lying. What documentation can Zev ask for under VAWA? Let's launch our second poll. Can Zev ask for a police report, a medical report, certification of VAWA violence, or none of the above? All right, let's go ahead and share that poll. Okay, so the correct answer is certification of VAWA violence. Zev can ask for certification of VAWA violence. Um, see, I think the confusion is Zev cannot require a specific type of documentation, but a landlord can ask for written certification, and that certification can be self-certification, which could be that certification of vow of violence form. Now, when you're working with survivors or somebody comes forward, there's oftentimes a person who is causing harm that you're also working with. This person may be a tenant, it may be a staff person, it may be somebody who's on the property. And this can be really scary for property owners or for program staff who are concerned about their own safety. So here are just a few tips for you. Always center the person. Think about the fact that this person might be scared or angry that they are being accused of being abusive by someone, not you, but by somebody, and they might be fearful of losing their housing. So we want to be professional and treat everybody with dignity and respect. It's always helpful if you're doing a lease bifurcation and splitting that lease that you are delivering news in pairs or getting somebody with authority to deliver that news. And you do it in a public place, somewhere where there's not going to be, where there'll be other folks around, maybe in the next room or in a professional setting, not in somebody's apartment, for example. And you want to acknowledge people's feelings. Like, it's okay to say, like, you seem really angry, you seem really upset, but you don't want to get into the details or get into the story. So if the person starts talking about how they're being framed or railroaded or this is all this other person's fault, you don't want to get into those details. Just stay focused on what has to happen next, which is here's the timeline for the move, here's some resources that are available, and you may not know that the National Domestic Violence Hotline also speaks to people who cause harm and helps them as well. So you can give them that number. All right, so here's your very quick policy check. You want to make sure that your current policies and procedures have all of the VAWA rights and protections that we talked about. And again, you'll get these slides so you can make sure that they're all in there. You want to make sure you're distributing that VAWA notice of occupancy rights at the 3 designated times: when somebody applies or is admitted or is receiving rental assistance, when someone is denied admission or denied rental assistance, and every time somebody is given a notice of eviction or told that their rental assistance will be terminated. You want to train staff to accept self-certification of violence and not require a certain type of third-party documentation. If you are going to pursue lease bifurcation, you want a policy in place that uses that language on that slide saying that if you commit criminal activity related to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, you can be evicted. Think through what your safety protocols are for staff when they're interacting with upset or violent people, and consider having an annual training on de-escalation techniques. This is helpful for all kinds of reasons. If you are in any kind of property management, you already know that. De-escalation, customer service positions really need to know how to bring down the temperature in those interactions. Are there any questions? Great. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Nastasia, to talk about the emergency transfers.
Okay, let's talk about emergency transfers. So, for folks that are newer to this space, these transfers requires each covered housing program to adopt and implement VAWA emergency transfer plan. Okay, let's talk about what this looks like. Next slide, please. So I want to walk through which programs are actually required to have an emergency transfer plan. So as you can see, this applies to several housing project types. And so the first one we're looking at is transitional housing programs. Any program operating transitional housing needs to have a plan in place. That also includes rapid rehousing and tenant-based rental assistance. So if your program is helping people to lease in you all's community, this plan applies to you also. We look at permanent supportive housing. Also, we look at project-based and scattered sites, permanent supportive housing. Doesn't matter how the housing is structured. This still holds true that you need a plan in place. We also talk a little bit about transitional rapid rehousing. Um, since they combine components, they still carry this requirement of having a plan in place. And then for those of you in Montgomery County, and those are of you who are familiar with the Housing Initiative Program, this is also included as well in needing to have a ETP. So long story short, if you're operating within any of these project types, you must have an emergency transfer plan. It isn't optional. It is absolutely a requirement. Now, fast forward, let's talk about the flip side, programs that are not particularly subject to VAWA emergency shelter requirements. This is where folks get tripped up because not every housing or service program has to follow, right, this specific piece. So we listed a couple here to talk about. So first, let's look at homeless prevention programs. They are not required to have an emergency shelter plan, right? These sort of programs typically focus on keeping people housed. So the requirement may look a little bit different. Same for emergency shelter programs, also not subject to this particular requirement. But what we like to emphasize here, even though emergency shelter programs are not subject to the requirement, it is still important to prioritize safety planning, right? So it may not be like a formal emergency transfer process, but it is some type of process in place. We also have programs like the short-term housing and the rental assistance program, the rental monthly allowance program, also not covered under any specific VAWA requirement, but still planning should take place. Um, and then Janice and I also want to emphasize, even though these programs are not subject to the transfer, the requirement, um, folks should still be prioritizing a plan for folks' safety, if that makes sense. And so think about how you respond to someone in need, how you move quickly, what supports do you all have in place when it comes to this piece, even though that they're not required to have plans. Okay, now let's get into you all's emergency transfer, the eligibility piece. Um, Janice and I and a few, we're gonna share a different screen and we are going to pull up the SEP's VAWA emergency transfer plan template that you all will become familiar with soon. And so this is what you'll begin to see. So you'll see that the template is designed to walk both staff and participants through the form step by step. It breaks it down by what the VAWA emergency transfer plan is. It breaks it down by who's eligible, how to request the transfer. It breaks down what documentation is needed. It covers pieces of confidentiality, pieces about timing, and then clear instructions for completing the form. And so one of the things here is that we don't want folks to feel like they're navigating all these pieces alone and in silo. And so I love this piece here because it also includes resources for survivors to reference. And so as we get ready to show you the form in 2.5 seconds, think about how some of this may show up in your day-to-day work now. Um, Janice, I think we're ready to show the form. And so, like I mentioned, all the pieces, what the transfer is, who's eligible, how to request the emergency transfer, um, Keep going. What should folks be able to provide as far as documentation? Is my information confidential? You'll also see places to input data in these spaces. It talks about emergency transfer timing, availability. Perfect. And so that's a snapshot of what it looks like. You all will be able to get your hands on this, I want to say pretty soon, as you all the site for this just launched. But we wanted to show you in real time what the resource would entail.
You can see those real-time resources that are local to you as well as the national resources available.
Let's break this down. Who qualifies for emergency transfer under VAWA? So first, the person, Janice has mentioned this quite a few times, the person has to be experiencing domestic violence of some sort, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, right? Second, they need to actually request the transfer. They need to express that they want to have the transfer. The third thing here is that there has to be a reasonable belief of imminent harm. So Janice gave the example of if me and her were in the same unit, having to show or believe that there is some imminent harm being in the same unit. And then for survivors for sexual assault, there is an additional pathway. So if the assault happened on the property within 90 days, that also meets the criteria for being eligible. We get into the process to submit a VAWA ET request. So let's walk through the process of what it looks like from the tenant to the participant perspective. So we take it from 1 through 6. So first, the person can either fill out the VAWA emergency transfer request form, or or they can, it's just as simple as a verbal request to their case manager. So making it really easy. From there, they can self-certify their experience. So if it's safe, providing any additional supporting documentation, this piece is not required upfront, but they can. Then the request gets submitted to the VAWA liaison, either directly through the case manager. At the same time, the participant should be offered resources. At the same time, they should be offered some form of safety planning. It's important to note that the participant or the survivor gets to decide what supports they want to engage with, totally up to them. Um, Fast forward, program staff are expected to review and respond really quickly. So within 3 business days of that request. And if any additional documentation is needed, the survivor has up to 14 days to provide anything additional. And so that's what that piece looks like. We talk about now we get into what is this, the housing provider role, right? So what does that look like? The VAWA liaison is the person in your program who will receive and process all the emergency transfer requests, right? It's customizable. Lease and addendum template provided by Seth will have a space for you to write whom and where this is going to. I believe you all's liaison is Diana. Is that right, Janice?
Yes,
Uh,
for that connection to coordinated entry, you're going to call Diana.
yes, yes. And so that is the process or the role with this particular piece. Then we get to um, the form itself. So I'm gonna walk us quickly through what this form looks like. So it starts out with basic info: name of the survivor, any household members. Um, Janice said this a few minutes ago. The survivor doesn't have to be the leaseholder. Okay, so we just keep that in mind. Then the form asks a couple other things. It asks where they're transferring from. This includes really simple, I want to say, check boxes for preference, right? So location, transportation, is it pet-friendly housing, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward, there's a section in there for safe contact info and certification. Um, Here, we note that self-certification is allowed, so keep that in mind. And then at the end of this, the survivor confirms eligibility, they sign off on the forms, and boom, the form is complete. We get into this next, oh, questions not asked. Uh, as you all are navigating the form, there are a few things that are not asked. It doesn't ask for a description of the abuser or the name of the partner. Um, these pieces of data are not necessary, right? It can be really dangerous to disclose, and so the form doesn't ask those pieces. And so that is a snapshot of what the form, how the form lays itself out. Janice, quiz.
Yes. So Uh, let's see, test your knowledge. Which of these programs is not required to provide a VAWA emergency transfer? Let's launch that poll. Is it transitional housing funded by ESG? Is it rapid rehousing funded by county HSP? Is it permanent supportive housing funded by the COC? Is it ESG emergency shelter, or is it none of the above? All of them are required to provide a VAWA emergency transfer. And the 30% of you who answered ESG funded emergency shelter are correct. Emergency shelter programs are not required to provide a VAWA emergency transfer. Think about it's just those rental assistance programs that are required to do the emergency transfer. So some of the other VAWA protections everybody has to follow. The emergency transfer only applies to those rental assistance type programs. All right, great. Let's continue on with the process. So once you receive a request, if additional information is needed, again, right, Nastasia and I both said that we were the survivor. You can request third-party documentation. The survivor gets to choose what kind of documentation that is, and the survivor could submit a document that's signed by a professional. Think lawyer, doctor, victim advocate, something like that. And they certify that this person is the survivor under penalty of perjury. A survivor could submit a copy of a protective order or a police report or a court proceeding. They could also give you other evidence. So sometimes survivors might give you a list, like show you the text messages or emails from someone that demonstrates that they are the survivor. The form that they provide is up to them, and then you can use that to proceed with the survivor for the emergency transfer. It is important that all of this information that I'm talking about be kept confidential. Keep that information separate from your regular tenant files because again, if the abusive partner is the one who is on the lease and it's in the tenant file, that person can have access to it. So you want to keep it in a separate file in a locked location with only those people who need to know, not any of the employees or contractors. It's really kept very limited, and that any information that's being released has to have a signed release of information accompanying it. So that should be time limited. It should be very specific about what information. I give, ABC Housing Corporation permission to talk with the COC Coordinated Entry VAWA Liaison for the next 30 days to coordinate my emergency transfer. As Nastasia mentioned, timely communication is really important. Remember, this person is in a situation where they are experiencing or have recently experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So we are asking that you provide an answer to the survivor within 3 business days of whether or not their application was approved or denied, if they need additional information. Make sure this information is delivered in writing and make sure it's delivered confidentially. What do we mean by that? Do not slide it under a tenant's door. Again, the abusive partner could get a hold of that. Don't tape it to a door. Make sure that you have that safe to contact information and you're only communicating via those channels. Once you've determined that a VAWA emergency transfer is going to happen, the first thing you do is look to see if there are any internal transfers. An internal transfer is not a new tenant. You're moving somebody from one unit to another unit. So if a landlord has a whole lot of apartments, you're moving them from maybe one side of the complex to the other side of the complex. Or if you're in a project-based unit, you're moving them down the hall or to another project. The unit has to be considered safe by the VAWA, by the person requesting the VAWA protections, so by the survivor. It's not if you, the landlord, or you, the program, feel it's safe. It's only if the survivor feels it's safe that they can move. Some programs offer through their operating dollars. If you have a project that has operating dollars, you could use that to do a same-day lock change. You could also partner with a local victim service provider. Sometimes they have flex funding to do those lock changes that can help to keep somebody out who while you're waiting for a transfer to go into effect. If you can't do an internal transfer in a timely fashion, you can explore an external transfer. This is considered a new tenant, so this might be I'm moving from a COC funded program to an ESG funded program. I would be considered a new tenant. The new program, the ESG recipient is only allowed to look at the minimum eligibility. So if you have different preferences, particularly for like housing authorities have different preferences, they're not allowed to look at those preferences only if the person is eligible as a tenant for their project. You can also look at programs within the COC or with outside of the COC. And so it's helpful to think about all the different programs. And then the survivor just has to show their eligibility at that minimum level for whichever project they're moving into. So you might consider working with local public housing authorities. Survivors might also just opt to transfer outside of the continuum of care, in which case they're no longer being paid for with the dollars in your community, but could effect a safe transfer that way. If it turns out that, again, Nastasia and I are in a relationship and she's still in the apartment, but I was the one who was eligible. So this might happen if, say, it's under HOPWA funding and Nastasia doesn't qualify for HOPWA funding, but she does qualify for COC funding. She's got 90 days to prove that she's eligible for that new funding source. And if she doesn't qualify for it, if she doesn't qualify for any of the federal funding, then she still has 90 days to be able to move to new housing. So she could move out of the state, move out of the county, move in with a sister, move somewhere else. But you can't just immediately evict somebody from the housing. You have to give them that grace period. You can give them up to a year. That is allowed. You can continue to pay the rental assistance for that period of time. But the grace period is up to you as a program. All right. This is our last case study, although it is in two parts. So, part one, Jay is approved for project-based rental assistance and recently moved into an apartment complex. Jay loves the building. Jay is very friendly, has made friends with all of the neighbors, loves the common space and all the amenities. One day, Jay's in the laundry room and a neighbor begins flirting. Jay is not really interested in this person in a romantic sense, but when Jay tries to leave the room, the neighbor pushes Jay up against the wall and tries to kiss and grope Jay. Fortunately, maintenance staff walks in and interrupts. Jay quickly leaves the room and stays with a friend, but after a month, Jay really just still no longer feels comfortable in this complex. Is Jay eligible for a VAWA emergency transfer? Let's launch the poll. Share the results. And the correct answer is yes, Jay is eligible. Anyone want to come off mute and tell us why?
It's a sexual assault that occurred in the building.
That's correct. And it was within the last 90 days. So that's the key is that sexual assault that occurs on premises within the last 90 days. And gold star for being brave enough to come off mute. Thank you. All right, part two. So Jay was approved for a VAWA emergency transfer after being sexually assaulted by a neighbor. The landlord tells Jay, good news. I evicted that neighbor because they were engaging in criminal conduct. So Jay, you no longer need to move. You can stay here. Jay still feels uncomfortable, right? Being in that laundry room is bringing up really uncomfortable feelings for Jay. But the COC funded housing program tells Jay that the request for emergency transfer is denied because the internal transfer, the unit, is safe and available. So, is the landlord interpreting VAWA emergency transfer requirement correctly? And is the housing program correct? So, let's launch our options. So, your options are that the landlord is correct, the housing program is correct, both the landlord and the housing program are correct, or both the landlord and the housing program are incorrect. Just to refresh your memory, the landlord said, you don't need to move because I got rid of the problem. And the COC program said, I'm denying your request because an internal unit is still available for you. And the correct answer, 83% of you answered correctly. The landlord and the housing program are incorrect. The only person who can determine safety is Jay. If Jay doesn't feel safe, it doesn't matter that the person has been evicted from the program. Jay can still request that transfer and is eligible for the transfer. And Jay is not required to accept the internal transfer. Jay is allowed to say, does not feel safe to me and I wish to do an external transfer. Great. All right. All right. So your quick policy check, you want to make sure that this updated VAWA emergency transfer plan that we've been talking about today and that Seth is going to send out to you and give you the link to is in effect by July 1st of 2026. So you've got a couple of months to figure out all these policies and make sure they're in your program policies and procedures. And the leases must have that VAWA lease addendum attached by July 1st, 2026. You don't have to go back and do any current leases. We're asking you just at their next renewal for those leases, make sure the lease addendum is attached. Some other policies you might want to have in effect are how will you protect survivors while they're waiting for an emergency transfer, and also a training on how to recognize, respond, and refer to disclosures. If you are a program that is receiving a VAWA request, so one COC program has called you and said, hey, there's a transfer, or Diana's calling you from the CES and is giving you that transfer request, what we're asking you to do is prioritize the VAWA transfer ahead of whatever other applicants you have, and that you only use the minimum eligibility to determine acceptance. And then you can coordinate with programs and with the local victim service providers on safety planning, physical moves, obtaining eligibility documentation. You might not know that you are allowed to move up to 10% of your funds without a grant amendment. And even if those activities on the screen are not in your current budget, you can still spend money under those categories for a VAWA emergency transfer. So if you didn't have moving costs in your grant, in your supportive services budget, you can still spend money on a VAWA emergency transfer for moving costs. So just keep that in mind. It's a very helpful budget tool that we want to make sure that you are aware of. And then finally, some safety tips for working with survivors. You do not have to investigate whether or not the survivor is telling the truth. In fact, this can traumatize your staff by hearing those disclosures, and it also will traumatize the survivor. So you don't need to do that. It's an extra step that doesn't need to happen. You can express concern for well-being and safety, saying things like, it's not your fault, I believe you, and offer those referrals to local victim service providers and other resources as available. And that is the end of our presentation. I'll stop sharing. There's our contact information there on the screen. Um, are there questions?
I just wanted to see a sample of like what would it look like on the lease? Like I don't know
Oh,
if you had a
yep,
sample of it.
sure do.
Thank you.
Okay, so the VAWA lease addendum looks like this. You're just going to attach it to your regular lease. You're going to fill in the tenant's name, the landlord name, where they're living, and then the agency VAWA liaison. So if that's you, you're just going to fill that information in there. That's the person they're going to contact. And then it just talks about what this addendum is, what the definitions are, what the protections are available for the survivor, the compliance with court orders, violations that don't involve being a survivor, that ability to still evict someone, your right to report a crime, the right to bifurcate a lease, what documentation you need. I'm sorry for the rapid scrolling. And then they're just going to sign that. The landlord's going to sign it, and then the provider is going to sign it, and that's it. So it just lists all the information there, so you don't have to figure it out. You just need to customize it for your program. That's correct. Diana is the coordinated entry system VAWA liaison. So when somebody is requesting that emergency transfer and you can't do an internal transfer, then you're going to call Diana to effect the emergency transfer through coordinated entry. Sometimes people ask me, like, landlords are not going to want to do this. They're not going to want to work with us. Some talking points for landlords. It is not a good look for a landlord to have a lot of violence occurring. It's bad for property damage. It's bad for tenants. You'll lose other tenants if they think there's a lot of violence going on. The protections in VAWA, the ability to bifurcate a lease and to protect a survivor, both keep the tenants who they want to keep in the building and also allow them to remove the tenants who are causing harm. So there are a lot of protections under VAWA that look like they're not favorable, but actually work in the favor of landlords. Any last questions?
I'm not sure how to ask this without sounding cynical. But uh, it's an unfortunate fact that a lot of people have difficulty leaving domestic violence relationships. What happens if they ask for help under VAWA, they move, and then they tell their abuser where they went, and it starts all over again?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not only might they tell their abusive partner, but their abusive partner might track them down independently, or they might decide that they want to reconcile, right? Because relationships are complicated, they're messy. The protections under VAWA do not require that somebody like there's not a time limit. So you could request as many emergency transfers as possible. What I usually say is that that's an opportunity for case managers to talk with the survivor about how, like, what happened in this situation? What could we do differently next time? Do you need extra assistance in being like sometimes they just don't feel like they're able to say no to the abusive partner. So that's really an opportunity for engagement. And then I also recommend that you talk with your local victim service provider because they are used to talking to survivors who are going back and forth in those relationships and can be really helpful in having those conversations and giving you tips to support survivors. I know we're over time. So I do want to thank everybody for attending today. You will get a copy of the slides and the materials that we referenced, and you'll get a copy of the recording. So thank you all very much and have a great day.